Hello everyone, I'm Mihoko. This video is a Shin-Kokinshu Wakashu Part 1. There are collections of poems called the three greatest anthologies of Japanese poetry. The Manyoshu, Kokinshu Wakashu, Shin-Kokinshu Wakashu. Manyoshu is the oldest existing collection of poetry. Kokinshu Wakashu, Kokinshu for short, is the first imperial anthology of Japanese poetry. Shin-Kokinshu Wakashu, Shin-Kokinshu for short, is the 8th imperial anthology. It literally means new collection of ancient and modern Japanese poetry. Kokinshu was compiled in the early 10th century. 300 years later, Shin-Kokinshu was compiled, mostly following the format of Kokinshu. In the Shin-Kokinshu, the total number of poems is about 2,000. The collection is divided into 20 volumes. All the poems are in tanka form. Tanka means short poetry. It consists of 5 lines with 57577 Japanese syllables. The famous poems from the Manyoshu onward were collected, except for the poems contained in the past 7 imperial anthologies. The two main themes of poems are 4 seasons and love, romance. There are 2 big differences between Kokinshu and Shin-Kokinshu. One is the historical background at the time they are compiled. The other is the role of the emperor in the compilation. While learning these 2 points, you'll appreciate 14 poems. I hope you'll enjoy it. When Kokinshu was compiled in the early 10th century, Kyoto was the center of politics and culture, and the aristocratic culture flourished with the emperor at the top. 300 years later, when Shin-Kokinshu was compiled, the samurai military government had been established in Kamakura, and the political center was shifting from the aristocracy in Kyoto to the samurai warriors in Kamakura. On Kokinshu, the Emperor Daigo simply selected the 4 poets to compile it, and he didn't get involved in the work himself, leaving everything to the compilers. On Shin-Kokinshu, not only did Emperor Go-Toba select 5 poets, including Fujiwara no Teika, to compile the anthology, but he himself was involved in the entire process. Even after creating Shin-Kokinshu with the compilers, he continued to work on the compilation and removed many poems from it. The first poem is by Emperor Go-Toba. He composed a poem on the subject of mountains at the age of 29. The verse in the poem implies the political path of righteousness. 奥山の驚がしたも踏み分けて、道あるよぞと人に知らせん。Deep in the mountains, I dare to make my way through the overgrown bushes to let the people know there is always a way. Deep in the mountains, I dare to make my way through the overgrown bushes to let the people know there is always a way. Emperor Go-Toba ascended the throne at the age of 4 during the unsettled period of the rise of the samurai warriors. He excelled in martial arts, musical instruments, and various arts from an early age. He was particularly interested in poetry, and he was a first-class poet. He wanted to boost court culture. He abdicated from the throne at the age of 19 and began to do what he wanted while holding the political power in the court. One of them was to compile an imperial anthology of poetry. When he was 41 in 1221, he challenged the samurai military government in Kamakura. He wanted to revive politics led by the imperial court, but he was severely defeated. As a result, the political power of the imperial court eliminated, and the power of the samurai government was stabilized. He was exiled to the Oki Islands and was never allowed to return to the capital. Living on the islands, his spiritual support was poetry and Buddhist prayer. He checked through Shin-Kokinshu again and removed about 400 poems from what were already in the collection. He passed away there at the age of 60. When Emperor Go-Toba was in power at the imperial court, he often held large poetry competitions. From among the works submitted to the poetry competitions, a great number of poems were contained in Shin-Kokinshu. The largest poetry competition was one where 30 excellent poets each composed 100 poems, and a judge determined the winner between the two works by two poets. In other words, 1,500 matches were held. One of the participants was a 15-year-old Kunaikyo. Her talent for poetry had been discovered by Emperor Go-Toba. Kunaikyo is not her real name, but the title of her position when she served Emperor Go-Toba as his lady-in-waiting. At the great competition, one of the poems Kunaikyo composed was the following. 薄く濃き延べの緑の若草に後まで見うる雪の村木へ Dark and light, shades of green, field of young grass, showing traces, snow melted unevenly. Dark and light, shades of green, field of young grass, showing traces, snow melted unevenly. The poem attracted a great deal of attention, and she became known as Young Grass Kunaikyo. She continued to produce excellent poems, but she was so devoted to poetry that she broke down and passed away at around the age of 20. In the court poetry circles of Kyoto at that time, there was a conflict between two groups of poets. They established their own poetry styles. When Fujiwara no Shunzei and his son Teika appeared in one family, their group power became immense, and they had many disciples among aristocrats. The next poem is by Fujiwara no Shunzei. Shunzei was a court nobleman and the head of one group of poets. Together with his disciples, including his son Teika and nephew Jakuren, he created a new style of poetry. He gained the trust and support of Emperor Go-Toba and led the poetry circles of that time. Shin-Kokinshu contains the works of many of his disciples. He continued to compose vigorously until his death at the age of 91. When he was 90, Emperor Go-Toba held a banquet to celebrate his long life. 誰かまた花立花に思い出ん。我も昔の人となりなば。As I remember the deceased, by the scent of Tachibana blossom, I wonder if someone would also think of me someday after I'm gone. As I remember the deceased, by the scent of Tachibana blossom, I wonder if someone would also think of me someday after I'm gone. The next one is by Fujiwara no Ietaka. He was one of the compilers of Shin-Kokinshu. He was from a high-class aristocratic family and studied poetry under Shunzei. Although he was a late blooming poet, He was highly regarded as one of the best poets, along with his contemporary Fujiwara no Teika. Even in his later years, his passion for poetry never diminished. He is said to have composed 60,000 poems during his lifetime. After Emperor Go-Toba was exiled to the Oki Islands, almost all high-ranking people stopped contacting him, but only Ietaka remained loyal to the end and continued exchanging poems with the emperor. When Ietaka was given the subject of enjoying in a field, he composed it. In most poetry competitions, a subject was given for the poem. 思うどち、そことも知らず行きくれぬ。花の宿かせ、延べのうぐいす。Walking around with no aim, along with my good fellows. Now the sun is going down. Dear wild warbler, share with us your flower lodge. Walking around with no aim, along with my good fellows. Now the sun is going down. Dear wild warbler, share with us your flower lodge. At that time Shin-Kokinshu was compiled, various techniques for creating poems were in vogue. One of them was to create new type of poems, borrowing one or two phrases from older works. Ietaka composed a new poem using the following poem by Priest Sosei, who lived 300 years before Ietaka. 思うどち、春の山辺に打ちぶれて、そことも言わぬ、旅寝してしが。Taking a field trip around the spring mountains, along with my good fellows, just hoping to relax and sleep, any place, just for one night. Taking a field trip around the spring mountains, along with my good fellows, just hoping to relax and sleep, any place, just for one night. The next one is by Priest Jakuren. Jakuren was a nephew of Shunzei. He was so talented in poetry that Shunzei adopted him as his successor when Jakuren was 12 years old. After Teika was born to Shunzei, Jakuren saw the potential for poetry in Teika and declined to remain as Shunzei's adopted son. After he became a priest in his 30s, he followed Priest Saigyo's example and visited various spots mentioned in ancient poems. Priest Saigyo had already been famous as a wandering poet. Jakuren was an excellent poet and made a great contribution to the flourishing of Shunzei's poetry group. Emperor Go-Toba selected Jakuren as one of the members to compile Shin-Kokinshu, but Jakuren soon passed away due to illness and was unable to join the team. 寂しさはその色年もなかりけり、巻き立つ山の秋の夕暮れ。It's not the colors making me feel lonely, even the evergreen mountains making no difference. It is the dusk in the autumn. It is not the colors making me feel lonely, even the evergreen mountains making no difference. It is the dusk in the autumn. One of the techniques of poetry at that time was to compose poems inspired by the contents of well-known old stories such as the tale of Genji. Using a free imagination, a poet could become a man or a woman and compose a poem. The next two female poets were good at composing love poems using this technique. The first is a poet known as Shunzei's daughter, although she was actually his grandchild. As her father lost his position in a political dispute, Shunzei adopted her as his daughter. She learned poetry from Shunzei. She got married in her late teens, and around the age of 30, she began to serve Emperor Go-Toba as his lady-in-waiting. She was very active as a poet in the court poetry circles. In her later years, she became a nun, but she remained active in the poetry world. When given the subject of love reflected in the clouds, she composed the following poem. 下萌えに思い消えなん煙だに後なき雲の果てぞ悲しき Pining secretly and die, the smoke from the cremation fades away with clouds, leaving no trace behind. How sad the ending. Pining secretly and die, the smoke from the cremation fades away with clouds, leaving no trace behind. How sad the ending. Princess Shokushi was the daughter of an emperor. In her teens, she was appointed by her father to serve the deities of the prestigious shrine in Kyoto. Her life was unstable due to the death of her father and the influence of her half-brother who had plotted treason. She studied poetry under Shunzei and exchanged poems with Teika. In Shin-Kokinshu, she has 49 poems, the most of any female poet. She remained unmarried throughout her life and became a nun in her later years. When she was given the subject of enduring secret love, she composed a poem. 玉の尾よ、絶えなば絶えね、ながらえば、忍ぶることの弱りもぞする。Oh, my life, if it should end, let it end. If I live longer, I'll bear no longer this secret love. Oh, my life, if it should end, let it end. If I live longer, I'll bear no longer this secret love. Fujiwara no Akisuke was aristocrat and the head of one of the two prestigious poetry groups. Japanese poets have long loved the moon and composed poems not only about the full moon, but also about the imperfect moon, such as the hazy moon, the crescent moon, and the moon hidden by clouds. Akisuke composed many dignified and elegant poems about the moon with simple expressions. 秋風にたなびく雲の絶え間より漏れいずる月の影のさやけさ In autumn breeze, drifting long clouds, leaking through their gaps, moonlight pouring in, so clear and bright. In autumn breeze, drifting long clouds, leaking through their gaps, moonlight pouring in, so clear and bright. The next is Fujiwara no Kiyosuke. He was a son of Akisuke. He succeeded his father as the head of his poetry group. He competed with Shunzei for the power in the court poetry world. As for his poetry group, he created its heyday. 冬枯れの森の口場の霜の上に落ちたる月の影の寒気さ In the winter forest, over the decayed leaves, the frost shining, reflecting the moonlight, piercing coldness. In the winter forest, over the decayed leaves, the frost shining, reflecting the moonlight, piercing coldness. Fujiwara no Teika was a son of Shunzei, as he was highly recognized by Emperor Go-Toba. In the compilation of Shin-Kokinshu, he played a central role along with the emperor. However, in later years, he composed several poems that angered the emperor and was disowned. After the emperor was exiled, he became the authority in the poetic circles again. In addition to Shin-Kokinshu, he also compiled several collections of poetry. One of them was 100 poems by 100 poets. He left behind written transcriptions and annotations of old classics, including the tale of Genji, so that many classic literatures can still be read today as they are then. The next poem by Teika was later highly praised by the great tea master for expressing the spirit of the tea ceremony. The tea master noticed that Teika had realized beauty in silence and solitude. It is difficult to understand the poem if it is translated literally, so I supplement the words first. The second one is a direct translation. 見渡せば花ももみじもなかりけり、裏の苫屋の秋の夕暮れ。I was looking around. No cherry blossoms, no colored leaves either. What I was moved to see, a simple hut by the sea, in the autumn dusk. I looked around. No cherry blossoms, no colored leaves either. I only found a simple hut by the sea, in the autumn dusk. Priest Jien was born into a prestigious aristocratic family, but his parents died when he was very young. With the help of his powerful elder brother, he devoted himself to Buddhist practice and assumed the top position in a large Buddhist sect. He gained the high trust of the Emperor Go-Toba and worked for the coordination of the rising military government in Kamakura and the court politics in Kyoto. It is said that he persuaded Emperor Go-Toba not to try to overthrow the samurai warrior government, but in vain. He was an excellent poet, and Shin-Kokinshu contains 92 of his poems, the second highest number after Priest Saigyo. 大山傾く月の影さえて、戸端の主に映る仮金。Over Mount Oe, illuminated by the moon, crying wild geese, flying down to the paddy fields, the land of Tobata. Over Mount Oe, illuminated by the moon, crying wild geese, flying down to the paddy fields, the land of Tobata. Kamo no Chomei was born as a son of a priest of a prestigious shrine in Kyoto. He was supposed to succeed to that position. However, when his father died, his position was taken by his uncle because of a family power struggle. He was so talented in playing musical instruments and composing poems that he served in the imperial court under Emperor Go-Toba. Around the age of 50, his uncle passed away and he competed with his cousin for the position of head priest of the shrine, but lost. Disappointed, he became a monk and lived in a small hut alone deep in the mountains. Living in a reclusive life, he enjoyed nature, poetry, and music while practicing Buddhism. He wrote an essay, Hojoki, based on the Buddhist view of impermanence and emptiness. It is widely read overseas. よもすがら一人見山の牧の葉に曇るも澄める有明の月 Through the lonely night, over the cypress leaves, the moon at dawn looks cloudy and clear to my wet eyes. Through the lonely night, over the cypress leaves, the moon at dawn looks cloudy and clear to my wet eyes. The last one is by Priest Saigyo. He was originally a samurai warrior and an officer of the Imperial Court Guard. He abandoned his wife and family at the age of 23 and became a monk. He was a friend of Shunzei and became famous as a wandering poet monk. Many poets in later generations, such as the greatest haiku master Basho, traveled in Saigyo's footsteps. Shin-Kokinshu contains the largest number, 94, of his poems. The moon and cherry blossoms were his favorite subjects. He especially loved cherry blossoms on Mount Yoshino. When he entered Mount Yoshino with his determination to live in seclusion, he composed a poem. 吉野山、やがていでじと思う海を、花散りなばと、人や祭らん。Me in Mount Yoshino, determined to stay here for life, wondering if my dear ones would expect me to return after flowers have fallen. Me in Mount Yoshino, determined to stay here for life, wondering if my dear ones would expect me to return after flowers have fallen. This is the end of Shin-Kokinshu Part 1.